A main idea of international humanitarian law, IHL, is that the means and methods of warfare are not unlimited. In fact, one of the 4 fundamental principles of IHL is to limit unnecessary suffering. Limiting unnecessary suffering is the IHL principle that forbids the infliction of suffering, injury, or destruction beyond what is necessary to accomplish a legitimate military purpose. The 4 fundamental principles of IHL, military necessity, limiting unnecessary suffering, proportionality, and distinction, work together as interdependent and reinforcing parts of a single system. Although the principle of military necessity justifies some suffering as necessary to defeat the enemy as quickly and efficiently as possible, military necessity cannot justify causing suffering that is not necessary to achieve that purpose. To do so will legitimize cruelty and wanton violence. For this reason, the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering is often thought of as the counterbalance to the principle of military necessity. On one hand, military necessity allows violence in armed conflict, while on the other hand, limiting unnecessary suffering places a limit on how violence can be inflicted. The first international agreement addressing the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering was the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration. In 1863, Russia developed a bullet which exploded on contact with hard surfaces. Its intended use was to blow up wooden ammunition wagons. By 1867, the bullet was modified so that it would explode on contact with softer surfaces, including the human body. Concerned that using a bullet against people would cause unnecessary suffering, the Russian government decided not to use the bullet. They also did not want other countries to use it either. Their answer was the 1868 St. Petersburg Declaration. This international agreement prohibited the use of exploding bullets because they caused greater suffering than was necessary to achieve a legitimate military goal. The modern definition of the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering is found in the 1977 Additional Protocol 1 to the Geneva Conventions of 1949. Article 35 of Additional Protocol 1 addresses the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering by stating, "It is prohibited to employ weapons, projectiles, and material and methods of warfare of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering." Put another way, weapons and tactics which are designed to create more suffering than is necessary to achieve a legitimate military objective will violate the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering. Additionally, once a military objective has been achieved, causing more suffering is unnecessary and must be avoided. The most common way nations ensure they follow the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering is to train their armed forces to cause no more suffering and destruction than is required by their mission. A more systematic approach is to conduct reviews of new weapons before allowing them on the battlefield. Additional Protocol 1 requires nations to study each new weapon to ensure the harm caused by the weapon does not result in unnecessary suffering or violate other provisions of IHL. Once a weapon has been approved and it's used in an approved manner, it should not violate the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering. While the principle of military necessity recognizes that suffering and destruction are necessary in armed conflict, the principle of limiting unnecessary suffering puts a limit on how much suffering is allowed. Suffering to achieve legitimate military objectives is unfortunate but necessary. Causing suffering that is not necessary to achieve a military objective is cruel and is prohibited. Produced by the American Red Cross. If you have any questions, please contact ihlaw@redcross.org.